I spent most of my life hiding the fact that I'm disabled. I've been legally blind since birth, but most people had no idea that I could barely make out the top E on a standard vision chart. I eventually came to regard my ruse as in many ways foolish and unwise. But I also think there are important lessons to be learned about disabilities from examining why I and others have sometimes gone to such great lengths to hide or downplay them. Although my condition is not as severe as those of other people, I've learned that things like curb cuts, sign language interpreters, and large print books are not enough on their own to fully correct for the disadvantages that are often associated with being disabled. We also need to examine and reform the ways in which we relate to, treat, and regard disabled family members and friends, colleagues, and briefly encountered strangers in our everyday lives. Now, when we think about disabled people, we often think about those who have physical or mental conditions that are obvious. But not all disabilities are like that. Some people have conditions that are not immediately perceptible or visible to casual bystanders, such as certain forms of autism, traumatic brain injury, chronic fatigue, or sensory impairments like mine. When someone has a condition like that, she may even have the option of attempting to pass as non-disabled, in much the way that someone might try to pass as heterosexual in a homophobic society. Hiding my disability was actually not as difficult as you might think. White-tipped canes and guide dogs were out, of course, and I often had to make up excuses to avoid situations that required normal vision. No, I don't think I'll be joining the fly fishing trip. Water's too cold for me. I think that in most areas of life, people tend to rely on stereotypes and folk wisdom in the ways that they regard and treat disabled people. So I had to not only imitate the appearance, mannerisms, and behavior of normally sighted people, but I had to seem to do so with normal ease and grace. I learned to fake eye contact, to identify people by the way they walk. Yes, you do all have a distinctive swagger. And to pretend to read printed text. Now, I actually got pretty good at this. I would hold a piece of paper at a normal distance, adopt a ponderous facial expression, like, move my eyes back and forth for what seemed an appropriate period of time, before finally offering a generic response. Oh, that's very interesting. What do you think? I became very good at listening to people, remembering what they say, and using that information to figure out what I was supposed to be looking at, say, on a restaurant menu. Yes, I guess I'll also have the fermented shark. That's just what I'm in the mood for. When teachers would put up math problems on the chalkboard that I couldn't see, I would sometimes pretend like I was asleep, or say I didn't know how to do them, or simply sarcastically answer something like purple or the Civil War. In my mind, it was better to be regarded as aloof, dim-witted, or rude than for my secret to be discovered. As I look back on why I hid my disability for so long, I've come to regret my evident immaturity and lack of self-acceptance and failure to take full advantage of the many political and legal advances that have been made for disabled people. Laws and public policies on their own, however, are not enough to fully correct for the kinds of informal attitudes and types of treatment that I was so desperately trying to avoid. There are the obvious instances of bullying, mockery, and condescension that disabled people often encounter. But I've also noticed that when people are aware of my condition, they tend to be somewhat more awkward around me and preoccupied with my disability. So Adam, what can you see? Or how do those glasses work? I've come to think that the appreciation that I receive from other people tends to be more for the ways and for the accommodations that I've gotten on certain things, rather than for my successes themselves, while the admiration that I do receive is often more for overcoming my disability rather than for my successes themselves. I think people tend to rely on folk wisdom, stereotypes, and their own guesses about how they would respond if they had a disability. They tend to assume, for example, that because I have a visual disability, I must have a cognitive disability, or that I failed to develop certain talents and skills. As a result, they seem to be somewhat less likely to assign important responsibilities to me, to trust or rely on me to accomplish various goals, or to include me in group projects and activities. Having strong relationships and being accepted, included, and appreciated are all good things that we have reasons to want in our lives. Without them, we're much worse off, and we risk falling into despondency and losing a sense of our own worth. Now, I'm somewhat embarrassed to admit this next part, but one kind of attitude that I regularly encounter is when other people have and show extra care and concern for me because I'm disabled. How can I justifiably feel disparaged, offended, or put down by those who are especially sensitive to my condition, who sympathize with the challenges I face, or who do nice things for me on account of my disability? Is it really possible to care about and help someone too much? Well, think of your own reactions you might have. If, for example, your father-in-law tries to give you career advice. If your wealthy aunt sends over hand-me-down clothes. Or if a dinner guest takes over the grill or the margarita stand, because as she sees it, you're just not doing it well enough. People with disabilities often find ourselves in situations of this kind. When teachers would sometimes find out about my condition, they would take it upon themselves to give me large print exams on huge pieces of paper in full view of the whole class. I've had people come up to me and sincerely say, "I'm so sorry this has happened to you," or "Good for you for being out and about." Friends have offered me advice about experimental treatments. And colleagues have sometimes forced an entire table of people to switch chairs so that I could see better. I know these people were sincerely concerned about me and my welfare. They weren't condescending to me or trying to embarrass me. And they often really did help me. But I would sometimes bristle at their evident kindness, while they were surprised and hurt by the cold reception they received. I admit that my reactions were sometimes exaggerated, but I've come to think that they are justified to some extent by thinking about the ideas of care and respect. One of the great moral challenges of life is to balance these conflicting moral values when they compete with each other. So consider some other examples from my own life. I can sometimes read printed text if I hold it close enough to my face. But other people will on occasion take this as an indication that I want or need them to read it out loud for me. Now sometimes they're right, of course. I really am struggling to read the fine print. But I also am sometimes somewhat offended by their presumptuousness in pretending to know what I can see and what I want. When I ask for and receive reasonable accommodations that are morally and legally required, officials will sometimes act as if they're doing me a huge favor. This can make me feel somewhat put down by their evident misunderstanding of my rights. Providing reasonable accommodations to disabled people is not mere charity or generosity. It's their moral and legal duty. I used to rock climb. I know, scary thought. But I guess it was good having my face plastered to the side of a mountain. I noticed, though, that when other climbers found out about my condition, they would sometimes take an extra interest in my knots and rig, but simply smile and nod when I would try to give them tips and strategies. These attitudes feed into a general perception of disabled people as weak, in need of protection, and less capable than others. Although I do admit that they sometimes save me from a few mishaps, so there you go. And finally, when I'm at conferences, fellow participants will sometimes take it upon themselves to direct me to the next room or tell me what's on the lunch buffet. The flip side of their generosity, however, is that there are now things that I have to do. I have to smile. I have to say thank you. I have to even be nicer to them than I otherwise would be. Now, don't get me wrong. I'm often quite pleased to show my gratitude for their evident kindness. But sometimes these necessary pleasantries can become onerous and make me feel somewhat subservient and put down when I would rather have just managed on my own. Loss of respect from others, even from those who are trying to help us, can undermine our dignity as persons. It can also diminish our sense of self-worth and perhaps even lead to more serious forms of exclusion and discrimination. So what can we do in our own lives to show proper care and respect to disabled people? Well, the first step is simply to recognize when these conflicts exist. We may find ourselves with an admirable desire to help someone with a disability, but we should also consider how to show her proper respect. If you encounter a disabled person who's choking, by all means, give her the Heimlich maneuver. But if you notice a wheelchair user appearing to struggle with a door, take a beat and think about whether you are making unwarranted assumptions about her, whether she has a right to your assistance, what messages you might be sending with your actions, and what sort of responses she might have to give in return. Considering these questions may affect whether or not you help her, or at least they may affect the manner in which you do so. We should also look for imaginative ways to show care and respect to disabled people. Sometimes the best option is to hide or downplay your assistance without dwelling on it or making a big deal about it. Perhaps it's enough to simply stand ready to help, to let the disabled person take the lead, and not to expect much gratitude in return. And on some occasions, it may be perfectly acceptable to just go on about your business. A key lesson in all of this is not to assume that simply because someone is disabled, that she wants or needs your help. Now, in light of these complexities, I think there are reasons for greater tolerance and understanding on both sides. Disabled people have reasons to recognize and appreciate the good intentions of others who are trying to help us, while perhaps also explaining how they could have done better. And when we are rebuffed in our efforts to help a disabled person, we should perhaps be more understanding of her reasons for doing so. I'm not recommending callousness or indifference to disabled people, nor suggesting that we should always or even usually refrain from helping them. The lesson instead is that the care and concern we should have for all people, including those with disabilities, should be guided and constrained by the respect we have for them as persons. My parents had very different ideas about how to raise a disabled child. My mother wanted me to have every accommodation under the sun, while my father signed me up to play rec basketball. I've come to think that my parents were both right in their approach to raising me. For my father's part, disabled people have to live in the world, as imperfect as it is, and to develop the skills and talents to survive and thrive in it. But my mother was right as well. It's not enough for disabled people to simply get by in an imperfect world. We also have reasons to change it by standing up for our rights, demanding respect, changing social attitudes, and showing others what we can do. That's why I ultimately came out as a disabled person. I'm immensely grateful for the help that I've received along the way. But strangely enough, I've sometimes felt most genuinely accepted when those who know about my condition have simply let me bump into things, miss my bus stop, or, as my daughter recently did, send me down a playground slide into a large puddle of water I couldn't see. Now that is moral progress. Thank you.